Hi, welcome to week 2 of the Sociology of Work and Technology. This week we're going to talk about techniques that are employed by capitalist organizations to extract the most labor power or capture the most surplus value from workers. We often think about work processes in a fairly unquestioning way. We just kind of show up, we go along with whatever our boss tells us to do. We say, oh, okay, this is how the working day is organized. This is how I'm supposed to come in and earn a living, and I'm supposed to do it this way or that way. And if, problems arise, sometimes people kind of cynically say something along the lines of, like, well, that's the way it is. What do you expect? It's work. And I think the purpose of this week's, readings isn't to necessarily question that response, but it is to think about, there are different ways in which work can be organized. And, work is always going to be organized in some particular way, but why is it organized the way in which it is? Why are there certain techniques employed in particular workplaces, and whose interests do those techniques serve? To what ends? Do they who do they work for? Right? Wait, what do these techniques do, and what do they make happen for whom? Now, I've assigned these readings this week because some of them are, quite prescriptive, and you see this with Adam Smith, but also Friedrich Taylor. And some of them are quite critical, most especially Marx and Harry Braverman. In fact, they're quite critical of Smith and Taylor. Now, Weber, I wouldn't say he's making a normative claim at all. He's not saying this is how things ought to be. And he's not exactly being critical. He's not criticizing bureaucracy per se. He's merely just trying to define what is bureaucracy. Right? Now, I might be getting ahead of myself, but basically what these describe are different ways, different techniques for controlling labor. So I just want to start by introducing you to some of the people that we read this week. First, you have Adam Smith, who was a Scottish philosopher and economist in the 18th century. You might have heard the phrase, the invisible hand of the market. That comes from him. Basically, the idea that people acting in their own self-interest is, what is most beneficial for humankind. I, of course, like a lot of sociologists, are quite critical of that idea, but that comes from Adam Smith. He's known as the sort of father of economics. He seemed to think rather highly of a finely segmented complex division of labor, which is something that you got from the excerpt from the book Wealth of Nations, which is what I gave you to read this week. Then you have Max Weber, who's most famous for the book The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which some of you may have read for another course. Basically, his argument is that culture, in that book, religious beliefs is what he means, culture, along with technology and economic systems, cause social change. And he's a sociologist and economist from the late 1800s and early 1900s. And then there's Karl Marx, who is a theorist of capitalism, commodities, and labor. Basically, he famously argued that economic organization produces, causes, or shapes social life. And then we have Friedrich Taylor, who was a proponent of scientific management, often called Taylorism. He was an engineer, process engineer in the early 20th century. He worked closely with steel manufacturers in the United States and used time motion studies to develop rather extreme examples of a modern detailed division of labor, basically kind of extending what Smith is describing into a more, what he claimed to be scientific and ultimately what he thought would be a more profitable mode of organizing work. And then finally, there's Harry Braverman, who was born in the early part of the 20th century, around 1920. And, curiously enough, I've been teaching this class for a number of years and have never really been able to find a good photo of him. So we're stuck with this blurry one, but if you find one online, let me know. I'd love to see it. Anyway, he was a leftist activist throughout the 20th century, and he was a sheet metal worker who became a book editor, most famously publishing the autobiography of Malcolm X, which for those of you who are unaware, Malcolm X is a pretty well-known black civil rights leader from the 1960s. He's from the United States, but is, I think, famous the world over as a advocate of black liberation. And so Braverman published his book in the 1960s, which was, I would say, pretty commendable. Anyway, so Braverman wrote and published Labor and Monopoly Capital, which I provided a chapter from this week. He published that in 1974, so just a little under 50 years ago. And this was important to the development of what's called labor process studies in sociology, but also critical management studies, histories of labor and related fields. And he died, fairly young at 55 in 1976. So he was going on 56. This week's lectures are kind of called, classical techniques in capitalist organization. All of these things that are described, especially by Smith and Taylor, they're all aimed at a sort of, what they would call a rational or kind of efficient achievement of some goal, at least in theory. Whether or not a bureaucratic organization or a Taylorist organization or a highly segmented, fine-grained division of labor like what's described by Smith, whether or not those are actually efficient or actually rational is a matter of some debate, but that's at least how it was historically thought of. So we have this sort of complex division of labor that you see with Smith in his description of nail manufacturing or pin manufacturing. You'll also see this in the video that I assigned, Nails. It's a short film funded by the National Film Board of Canada. And then, Weber describes bureaucracy, which is a sort of rule-based, hierarchical mode of governing that can be applied in a context of capitalist organizations as well as non-capitalist organizations, as is famous examples being the Soviet Union was highly bureaucratically organized, just as which is a communist government, as is the Canadian government is highly bureaucratically organized, but up until fairly recently, most organizations, for-profit capitalist organizations, are also bureaucracies. And then scientific management, aka Taylorism, which is we'll get into what that means a little bit later. Now, for capitalist organizations, the goal of these sort of rational or efficient modes of organizing is generally profit making. So, capitalist organizations generally try to get more out of people than they pay those people in order to make a profit, right? This is what Marx called surplus value. So the simplest or a simpler form of organizing work, one that's simpler than any of the things I just mentioned, is craft production. And this came up in the readings from last week, too. They talked about the decline in craft production. And that decline coincided with the industrialization of Canada, you might remember. Now, in craft production, you might remember this from last week's lectures, the planning or carrying out of work tends to be combined, meaning the people who come up with how to do something are also the ones who carry it out. Often one person performs most tasks. Now, I mentioned last time that was kind of different in small households who would manufacture goods where there was obviously a small division of labor. You might remember I kind of said, well, exploitation kind of begins in the home. Anyway, craft production usually, rather than say household production, craft production, it's usually like a craftsperson kind of comes up with how best to accomplish some goal and then, carries it out. This still persists today in some occupations. But, I think what was crucial to understand in differentiating this from Taylorism or this sort of complex division of labor described by Smith is found in Braverman. On page 92, he says, the craft provided a daily link between science and work. Since the craftsman or craftsperson was constantly called upon to use rudimentary scientific knowledge, mathematics, drawing, etc., in their practice, right? Meaning that, say you're a woodworker, you're building some shelves or something like that, and you didn't buy them from IKEA, right? You're making them from scratch. You'd first design that. You would use some basic math, maybe some basic understanding of the kinds of supports that need to be in place to hold a shelf up, that sort of thing. You might even draw a little bit. And all of these different skills, this complex series of skills, would all be performed by, you, or maybe you and one other person. Meaning you have to think a lot. And you're also quite autonomous. You're in control. Now, often this way of organizing work can be quite slow, right? Something that's produced, say, a bookcase or a bookshelf that's built by a single person can take a while, as opposed to, say, something that's built in a factory, right? Or even just thinking about building that shelf, this fictional shelf, right, that you design as compared to one that you might buy from IKEA would take a long time. It's quite slow. I mean, we could step back and kind of think critically about that. I mean, we tend to equate slowness with things being bad, but you might say, well, is that really so bad? Like, what's the problem with that? And maybe there isn't one, but if your goal is to produce a lot and sell those things for a profit, then maybe you don't want things to be slow. You want to get more out of people in a single day, right? I don't know. This is exactly the argument that Smith is kind of making, right? And he's saying an elaborate division of labor, one in which, that's really fine-grained. He describes pin manufacturing, right, where they have the person who draws out the wire, the person who sands the top down to attach the top of the pin, the person who sharpens it, and the person who does, for each motion almost, there's a different person carrying that out, right? And the plan for that comes from the capitalist or the owner or the manager. So there's quite an elaborate division of labor in which each task in a larger process is performed by an individual worker. This increases productivity. This is the argument made by Smith. It increases specialization. He makes much to do about how skilled one can become in these, fine-grained small tasks, more skilled than any craftsperson ever could be. But another way of thinking about it is it de-skills the work. It decreases skills. It eliminates the need to employ that basic scientific knowledge, the experimentation or drawing that someone, a craftsperson, might engage in. Which is to say, it potentially decreases labor costs. You don't need someone who has experience or extensive training. You just need someone who can do one singular thing over and over and over and over again. This, he says, increases profit. And it might. But we might, think critically and say, well, how does it do that? And for whom does it increase profit? Now, Smith would be of the opinion, I think most people who are kind of uncritical of capitalism, or at least supportive of capitalism, would say, well, increase profits for the corporation or the capitalist or the owner, would result in better wages or better, pay and this sort of thing, which in the actual reality in which we live in is never the case, or rarely the case. And so, seems to me that what this is actually about, it's about, heightening exploitation to increase profits. And I think this is the critique that's leveled by Marx, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So, this more complex form of organization that's described by Smith, it increases specialization. Skills improve within specific tasks, but overall knowledge kind of decreases, right? So you might get really good at some sort of like hammering the top of the nail onto the nail or whatever Smith describes, but your overall understanding of like how to make nails decreases. And this is something I think you see quite clearly in the video, the short film that I have it on cue. So this finely segmented division of labor, there's a number of different criticisms of it. One of which is that it's like, deadening or dulling, alienating, right? And this would be one of the many kind of Marxist critiques that we might level at this. But at the same time, it could be quite exciting. And if you think about, things, production processes with a heightened division of labor, one of which is like film production, right? And you have quite, if you ever watch like the credits at the end of a film, it's like a small army of people do the work of filmmaking. And, some of those jobs people get quite excited about, being the key makeup artist, the key apprentice assistant editor, or whatever, doing these different sorts of jobs can be kind of exciting. So the sort of emotional or affective content of this heightened division of labor is maybe kind of more complicated than I think a conventional, kind of Marxist viewpoint like represented by Braverman might let on. Anyway, so you have this division of labor, you have these people doing these, different tasks, but how do you get them to do anything? How do you ensure that they actually do the work? So complex division of labor, is a more efficient use of time. Sure, maybe, I don't know. How do you guarantee that? Well, one of the ways in which you can try to guarantee that are rules, right? And rules can take the form of either, what we might call a carrot or a stick, a reward or a punishment. That could be built into rules. But rules, more generally, are sort of orders of operation, procedures. How is it that things should be done? What rules govern? What sub rules govern that procedure, etc. Rules also can establish hierarchical authority, right? So not just one boss that kind of oversees everyone, but maybe different layers of authority, right? Different layers in a hierarchy, with one ruler at the top, and then subordinates possessing particular authorities that cover particular areas of the organization that they have power over. So you have sort of upper management, executives, mid-level management, and that sort of thing. And these are each kind of rule-bound hierarchies, right? This person oversees this person who oversees that person. What do we call this? This is what Weber is describing, right? He calls this bureaucracy. Now, it's often used negatively today. People say, oh, the bureaucracy, right? You might hear me or some other faculty members say that about Queens. Oh, it's so bureaucratic and annoying, right? You might say that yourself about the university. But for Weber and many others, bureaucracy, as compared to say like the rule by kings or queens, was more efficient, more orderly, more modern. And you might say, well, why? Well, it made things into rules that you can know. I mean, if you compare it to dependence on, say, individual people who hold authority, you're no longer subject to the random whims of nobility. but you are subject to the inhuman decisions made in accordance with rules. What does this do? It makes things reproducible. Results can be reproduced, which I think is a focal concern with Smith as well. And so this is another kind of classic way of organizing work. So you have this division of labor, you have the codification of that division of labor in a bureaucracy, which is to say that rules are made, different layers of managers and workers are made, right? There's different levels in a hierarchy. And that this ensures a certain reproducibility of results. Okay, with that in mind, I want to stop here and just to break this up, and I'll see you in the next video where we talk a little bit more about sort of Marx's critique of this, and then we talk a little bit about Taylorism. All right, see you then.